First story, The Commercial Pilot, 1995. I still don't know what really happened that night. Even now, years later, I can't explain it, and honestly, I've stopped trying. I was a commercial pilot, thousands of flight hours under my belt, experienced in every way that mattered. It was a routine transatlantic flight, the kind I had done more times than I could count. The sky was clear, the instruments were steady, and there was nothing to suggest that anything unusual was about to happen. But then, out of nowhere, the radios cut to static. At first, I thought it was just atmospheric interference, nothing unusual when flying over the ocean. I tried switching frequencies, but all I got was an eerie, dead silence. That's when I noticed the light. At first, it was just a faint glow on the horizon, something I assumed was another aircraft. But within seconds it grew, brighter, larger, impossibly fast. It was coming straight at us. My first instinct was to check my instruments, to see if air traffic control had sent a warning about nearby traffic. But there was nothing. No blip on the radar, no warning from ATC. Just that blinding white light, growing more intense by the second. It wasn't like any aircraft I had ever seen. It didn't have the rhythmic strobes of a plane or the familiar red and green navigation lights. It was pure, searing white, almost painful to look at. I felt my hands tighten around the yoke as I braced for a possible collision. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the light enveloped everything. The cockpit, the instruments, my own body. I was swallowed whole by it. I felt a strange pressure, like my entire body was being pulled apart and compressed at the same time. My ears rang, and for a brief moment I thought I could hear something, a faint, high-pitched sound, almost like whispers, but too distorted to make sense of. And then, nothing. The next thing I remember, I was still in the cockpit, gripping the controls so tightly my knuckles were white. The radios were back to normal, the instruments steady, everything exactly as it should have been, except for one thing. My co-pilot was staring at me, pale as a ghost, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Where the hell were you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I was about to ask him what he meant when I glanced at the flight clock, and my stomach dropped. 2 hours were gone, just missing. The last thing I remembered was seeing that impossible light, and now, somehow, we had lost 2 full hours of flight time. The plane was still on course, but it was as if we had skipped ahead in time, as if something, or someone, had pressed fast forward on reality itself. My hands were shaking as I reached for the radio, trying to get a response from air traffic control, but my mind was screaming at me that something was very, very wrong. I kept my voice steady as I called ATC, but inside I was anything but calm. "Control, this is Flight 217. Do you read?" A few seconds of silence, then a response. Normal, routine, as if nothing had happened. But when I checked our location, my stomach twisted into a knot. We were exactly where we should have been, if we hadn't lost any time. No course deviation, no sign that we had been drifting aimlessly. It was as if we had continued flying the route normally, except neither of us could remember any of it. My co-pilot was visibly shaken, staring at the instruments like they might suddenly change. "This isn't possible," he muttered under his breath. I wanted to reassure him, to come up with some logical explanation, but I had none. The only thing I knew for certain was that we had been in control of that plane one moment, and the next we had lost 2 hours without a single second of memory to account for it. The rest of the flight continued in eerie silence. My hands were still trembling slightly as I monitored the instruments, my brain struggling to make sense of what had happened. I kept checking my watch, my flight log, anything that might give me some kind of answer, but the timeline remained impossibly intact. It wasn't until we landed that the weight of it all truly hit me. The second the wheels touched the runway, I felt an overwhelming sense of disorientation, like stepping out of a dream you weren't aware you were having. My co-pilot didn't say a word as we taxied to the gate, his face pale, his fingers gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had turned white. As soon as we reached the terminal, I excused myself and rushed to the bathroom. I needed a moment alone, a moment to breathe. But when I looked in the mirror, my breath caught in my throat. There was something on my arm. It was a mark. Small, circular, like a perfectly symmetrical burn just below my wrist. I touched it, expecting it to hurt, but it didn't. It wasn't there when I boarded the plane. I was sure of it. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I ran my fingers over the mark. Again, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I leaned against something, burned myself without realizing? But no, this was too precise, too deliberate. I tried to shake off the unease, but the feeling of wrongness clung to me like a second skin. When I finally left the bathroom, my co-pilot was waiting outside, his eyes locked on me like he knew. He didn't say anything, but after a moment, he rolled up his sleeve. My stomach turned to ice. He had the same mark, identical, same size, same spot. We stared at each other, and in that moment I knew we had gone somewhere. We had been taken. And whatever had happened during those lost 2 hours, we weren't supposed to remember it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was falling into that white light, into that endless void of nothingness. I kept waking up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced that if I closed my eyes again, I wouldn't wake up. The mark on my wrist still didn't hurt, but it was there, a constant reminder that something had happened, something I couldn't explain. I kept staring at it, running my fingers over the smooth skin, half expecting it to fade like a bruise. But it didn't. It stayed, solid and unchanging. I considered calling someone, maybe a doctor, maybe even someone at the airline. But what the hell was I supposed to say? That I blacked out for 2 hours mid-flight and woke up with a strange mark on my skin? They'd ground me for good, maybe even revoke my license. So I stayed quiet. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The next morning, my co-pilot called me. I almost didn't answer, but something told me he was just as lost as I was. When I picked up, there was silence on the other end for a few seconds before he finally spoke. "Did you dream about it?" I felt my stomach tighten. I had no idea what it was, but I knew exactly what he meant. "I keep seeing the light," I admitted, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. "And something else. Shapes. Shadows." My co-pilot exhaled sharply. "Yeah, same here." We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, he broke it. I don't think we should talk about this, not to anyone." There was something in his voice that unsettled me. A quiet fear, like he was afraid that just saying the words out loud would make them real. I wanted to argue, to tell him we needed to figure this out. But deep down, I knew he was right. Some things aren't meant to be understood. For weeks I tried to convince myself that it was just an anomaly, an unexplained but ultimately harmless event. Pilots experience weird things all the time. Lights in the sky, radar glitches, atmospheric disturbances. Maybe this was just one of those things. But the dreams never stopped. Every night, I was back in that cockpit, staring into that impossible brightness. Sometimes I felt like I was floating, weightless, surrounded by a vast emptiness. Other times, I saw figures, tall, thin, standing just beyond the edge of my vision. I could never see their faces, but I could feel them watching, waiting. And then, one night, I woke up gasping for air, my body rigid with fear. I scrambled to turn on the light, to ground myself in reality. But when I did, my breath caught in my throat. The mark on my wrist, it was darker now, more pronounced, like it had been pressed deeper into my skin. And worst of all, I could swear it was pulsing. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But the more I looked at the mark, the more I felt like something was wrong, like it wasn't just a scar or a burn, but something alive. I kept rubbing at it, pressing my fingers into the skin, half expecting it to hurt or peel away. It never did. The pulsing sensation wasn't constant, but when it happened, it sent a dull ache up my arm, almost like a cramp deep beneath the skin. I started wearing long sleeves all the time, even when it was warm, just to avoid looking at it. But covering it up didn't help. The dreams got worse. They weren't just flashes of light anymore. I could hear things now, whispers, mechanical clicking sounds, a strange low hum that vibrated through my entire body. And then, one night I saw them. It wasn't a dream. I know it wasn't. I woke up in my bed, but I couldn't move. Sleep. Paralysis, I told myself at first. But deep down, I knew better. The room was dimly lit by the glow of the street lamp outside, and for a moment, everything looked normal. But then I noticed the shadows. They weren't moving like they should have. The corners of the room seemed darker, like something was standing there just out of sight. My breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as I tried to force my body to move, to scream, to do something. That's when they stepped forward. Tall, thin. Their limbs were impossibly long, their skin smooth and gray, almost reflective in the faint light. They didn't speak. They didn't make a sound. They just stared. And in that moment, I knew. I had seen them before. The pressure returned, that same crushing sensation I had felt in the cockpit when the light swallowed us. My chest tightened, my vision blurred, and for a split second, I thought I was going to pass out. But then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. I bolted upright in bed, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was empty. The shadows were gone. But the mark on my wrist, it was burning. I flicked on the bedside lamp and stared at it, my pulse pounding in my ears. It wasn't just darker, it was changing. The once perfect circle now had faint lines running through it, almost like symbols, patterns I didn't recognize. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone, desperate to tell someone, anyone, what was happening to me. But when I opened my messages, my blood ran cold. There was a new text from an unknown number, 3 words. Do not remember. I stared at the message, my entire body locked in place. My first instinct was to delete it, to pretend I never saw it, but I couldn't. My hands were clammy, my breathing shallow. Who sent this? How did they send this? I hadn't told anyone. Not my family, not my co-workers, no one. My co-pilot was the only other person who knew, and I hadn't spoken to him in weeks. My fingers trembled as I tried to type a response, but before I could even finish, my phone screen flickered and shut off. The battery was full. There was no reason for it to power down. My gut twisted with a deep primal fear, the kind I hadn't felt since that night in the cockpit. I forced myself to move, to stand up and pace the room, trying to shake off the growing paranoia clawing its way through my mind. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. My reflection in the dark window. My body, my face, unchanged. But my arm, the mark on my wrist was glowing, I stumbled back, heart hammering against my ribs. The glow was faint, a soft bluish hue pulsing like a weak heartbeat. It wasn't just a mark anymore. It was active. I reached out with my other hand, fingers hovering over my wrist, afraid to touch it. The second I did, a sharp electric jolt shot up my arm, making me yelp. It wasn't painful exactly, but it felt wrong, like something foreign was embedded deep beneath my skin. My breathing turned ragged, my pulse erratic. I had to get help. A doctor, a scientist, someone who could explain what was happening to me. But as I grabbed my phone again, it powered back on by itself. The message was gone, no trace of it. And before I could even process that, another notification popped up. A voicemail, no caller ID. Hands shaking, I pressed play. Static. At first, that's all it was. But then, beneath the noise, I heard it. A voice, garbled, distant, speaking in a language I didn't understand. And then, in perfect mechanical English. "You were not supposed to see." I dropped the phone. My entire body was shaking now, cold sweat dripping down my back. I wanted to believe this was just stress, exhaustion, paranoia. But I knew better. Something had changed in me that night. Something was still changing. The mark, the missing time, the voices. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't losing my mind. But what scared me most wasn't what I remembered. It was what I didn't remember. Those missing 2 hours, what happened? What did they do to us? Why were we taken? And why were they so desperate to make sure we forgot? I thought about my co-pilot, about the matching mark on his arm. Was he experiencing this too? Had he gotten the same messages? The same nightmares? I needed to talk to him. Needed to know I wasn't alone in this. I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door, my pulse still racing. But just as I reached my car, a strange sensation washed over me. Dizziness, pressure, the feeling of being watched. And then, the light returned. It wasn't like last time. There was no slow buildup, no distant glow on the horizon. It was instantaneous. 1 second, I was standing next to my car, fumbling with my keys. The next, I was blinded, weightless, my body suspended in an empty void. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think. And then, just as suddenly, I was back. Standing in the exact same spot, the keys still in my hand. But something was different. The air smelled wrong, like burnt metal and ozone. My vision was blurry, my head pounding. I stumbled forward, gripping the car door for support. And then, slowly, I looked down at my wrist. The mark was gone, completely. No scar, no discoloration, nothing. Like it had never been there at all. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A new message from that same unknown number. 3 words again, but different this time. "You are done. I haven't seen the light since. Haven't had the dreams. It's like they wiped it all away. And yet, I still feel it. Deep in my bones, in the empty spaces of my mind. I know they're still watching. I know they can come back whenever they want. And worst of all, I know that next time, I might not return." Second story, The Tourist in Machu Picchu, 2015. I still don't know how to explain what happened to me that day in Machu Picchu. Even now, years later, the memory feels like a dream that never quite fades, like something just outside my grasp. But it wasn't a dream. I was there, I lived it, and I know what I saw. I had always wanted to visit Machu Picchu, and when I finally got the chance, I planned everything meticulously. Flights, hotels, permits. I was traveling alone, something I'd done before, and I liked the freedom of setting my own pace. The morning started like any other. A misty sunrise over the ruins, the golden light hitting the ancient stones in a way that felt almost otherworldly. I was walking along a less crowded trail, away from the main tourist paths, when I noticed something strange. A group of people, or at least that's what I thought at first, standing near an alcove carved into the mountainside. They weren't moving like tourists. They weren't talking. They just stood there, staring. And then, in unison, they turned to look at me. My first thought was that they were guides, maybe local shamans performing some kind of ritual. But as I stepped closer, something felt off. Their faces weren't quite right. Their features were too symmetrical, their eyes too large, and there was something unsettling about the way their skin caught the light, almost reflective, like polished stone. My body tensed, every instinct telling me to turn around, to walk away. But I didn't. I couldn't. One of them, a tall figure draped in a dark, seamless robe, lifted an arm and pointed toward the alcove. At first I didn't understand. Then, something in my mind shifted, like a whisper of thought that wasn't my own. Come. My feet moved before I could decide whether to follow. It was like I wasn't fully in control anymore. The moment I stepped closer, the air around me changed. The world felt heavier, denser, as if I had crossed an invisible barrier. And then, without warning, everything around me dissolved into pure, blinding white. I don't remember how long I was in that white void. It wasn't just bright, it was absence. No sound, no ground beneath my feet, no sense of time passing. It was like my body had been stripped away, leaving only my consciousness, floating in something infinite. I wanted to scream, but I wasn't sure if I even had a mouth anymore. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. I was standing again, but not in Machu Picchu. The landscape around me was vast and unfamiliar. Smooth metallic surfaces, tall, monolithic, structures stretching into a sky that wasn't really a sky at all, more like a swirling mass of color and light. The air was thick, humming with an energy I could feel in my bones. And then I saw them, tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and skin that shimmered like liquid mercury. They stood in a perfect semicircle around me, watching, observing. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. And then, just as before, a thought that wasn't mine entered my mind. You are not supposed to be here. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I couldn't. It wasn't just fear keeping me still. It was like something was holding me, in place, not physically, but mentally. My body refused to obey me. The beings, whatever they were, never moved closer, but I could feel them in my mind, shifting through my thoughts like they were flipping through the pages of a book. Not ready, not ready. The words weren't spoken, but I heard them. They echoed inside my skull, each syllable vibrating deep in my bones. I wasn't sure if they were communicating with each other or speaking to me, but I knew one thing. They had complete control. And then, without warning, the space around me bent. It was the only way I can describe it. The world twisted in on itself, colors and shapes folding into something incomprehensible. And before I could even try to understand what was happening, I was somewhere else. I was back at Machu Picchu, but it wasn't right. The air felt too thick, too charged, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. The ruins looked the same, but there were no tourists, no guides, no sound, just silence. A deep, oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. My legs gave out beneath me and I collapsed onto the stone ground, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. I checked my phone. The screen flickered erratically, the time jumping back and forth between different hours before finally settling on something that made my stomach drop. 6 hours had passed. It felt like minutes, maybe even seconds, but I had been gone for 6 hours. My backpack was still with me, my camera, my water bottle, everything exactly as I had left it. But I knew something had changed. The world felt different. I felt different. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw them. Not the beings from before, but 3 figures standing near the edge of the ruins watching me. They were human. At least they looked human. But deep down, I knew the truth. They weren't. I didn't stay to find out what they wanted. My instincts finally took over and I bolted. My legs ached, my chest burned, but I didn't stop. I ran through the ruins, past confused tourists and guides who hadn't seen me before, who had no idea that I had vanished from this place just hours ago. I made it back to the entrance, where a park ranger gave me a strange look and asked if I was okay. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to beg for answers. But the words wouldn't come out. My mind felt scrambled, like a radio stuck between frequencies. Somehow I made it back to my hotel. I locked the door, sat on the bed, and stared at my reflection in the mirror for what felt like hours. Something was wrong with my eyes. They looked the same, but they weren't. I felt like I was looking at someone else, someone almost me. And that's when I noticed it. A thin, barely visible mark just behind my ear. A perfect circle, smooth and cold to the touch. I don't know how long it had been there. I don't know what it means, but I haven't been the same since. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was somewhere else. Like my body was in the hotel room, but my mind was floating in that white void again. And the worst part, the dreams. Or maybe they weren't dreams at all. Flashes of symbols I couldn't understand. Sounds that weren't sounds, more like vibrations rattling inside my skull. I saw their faces, those elongated, symmetrical faces, staring at me, studying me. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I checked the mark behind my ear again, hoping I had imagined it, but it was still there, smooth and cold under my fingertips. I needed to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind, that this wasn't just some bizarre fever dream. So I did something that, looking back, I regret more than anything else. I checked my camera. My hands were shaking as I flipped through the pictures. Most of them were normal. Sunrise over Machu Picchu, selfies, the usual tourist shots. But then, about halfway through, I found something that shouldn't have been there. A photo I didn't take. It was blurry, distorted, like it had been taken while moving at an impossible speed. At first, I thought it was just a corrupted file. But the more I stared, the more I started to see it. Shapes, structures, a metallic landscape stretching endlessly into the distance. And in the foreground, a figure, one of them, tall, thin, its skin glistening under a light that didn't come from any sun I knew. It wasn't looking at the camera, it was looking at me, as if it knew I would find this picture, as if it had put it there. My stomach turned to ice. I dropped the camera, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This wasn't just a missing time incident. They had taken me, and they wanted me to remember. I left Peru the next day. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not the hotel staff, not the airport security, not even the friend I had planned to call once I got back home. I couldn't. How could I even explain it? Hey, I think I was abducted by aliens in Machu Picchu, and now I have missing time, a strange mark on my skin, and a picture on my camera I know I didn't take. No one would believe me. Hell, I barely believed myself. But the fear never left. Even after I landed back home, even after I locked myself in my apartment and tried to pretend none of it happened, I could feel them, watching, waiting. And then a week later, I woke up in my bed with dirt under my fingernails. I hadn't left my apartment, the doors were still locked, but I knew I had been somewhere else. After that night, my life was never the same. It wasn't just paranoia. I knew I wasn't alone. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. My electronics glitched at random, my phone screen flickering whenever I picked it up, the TV turning on by itself in the middle of the night. But the worst part? The dreams got worse. They weren't just flashes of symbols anymore. I started seeing things with an impossible clarity, places I had never been, skies that weren't Earth's, them. Sometimes I'd wake up gasping for air, my body locked in place, unable to move, feeling like something was still there in the room with me. The mark behind my ear itched constantly, a dull burning sensation that never really went away. And then one morning I woke up and it was gone. Not faded, not healed. Gone. Like it had never been there in the first place. That should have made me feel relieved. It didn't. It felt like a warning. I tried to go back to normal, but they wouldn't let me. I started getting migraines, blinding, nauseating headaches that would hit me at random. And every time they did, I'd hear something. A low, buzzing hum in the back of my skull, like a transmission I couldn't quite tune into. I stopped sleeping, properly, too scared of what I might see if I closed my eyes for too long. And then the gaps started happening. At first, I convinced myself I was just zoning out, losing track of time. But it kept happening. Short lapses at first, a few minutes here and there. Then, one day, I checked my phone and realized an entire hour had passed and I had no memory of what I had been doing. The scariest part. My shoes were wet like I had been outside in the rain. But I hadn't left my apartment. Or at least I didn't remember leaving. That was the moment I knew they weren't done with me. Whatever had happened in Machu Picchu wasn't just a one-time thing. They had marked me, and now they could come and go as they pleased. I started sleeping with the lights on, keeping my phone in my hand at all times, trying to record anything that could prove. To myself, I wasn't going insane, but it was like they knew what I was trying to do. Every time I tried to set up a camera, the footage would be corrupted. Every time I tried to record my voice, the audio would be filled with static. And then, one night, I woke up standing in the middle of my living room, facing the window. I didn't remember getting up. I didn't remember walking there. But my hand was pressed against the glass, my fingertips cold, my breath slow and steady, like I had been standing there for hours. Outside, in the dark, a tall figure stood beneath the streetlight, not moving, not blinking, just watching me. I don't know how long I stood there staring at that figure. I wanted to move, to step back, to do anything, but my body wouldn't listen. My breath felt too slow, my heart too calm, like I wasn't even fully there. And then, just like before, the thought entered my mind, not spoken but felt. You are not supposed to be here. My vision blurred, my head pulsed with that low electric hum, and for a split second, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was somewhere else. The metallic landscape stretched before me again, endless and cold. The air buzzed with energy, a hum so deep I could feel it vibrating through my bones. And then, a hand. Long, thin fingers with smooth, glistening skin reached out from the darkness, stopping just inches from my face. I wanted to scream, to run, but before I could react, everything went black. When I came to, I was back in my apartment, lying on the floor. My head ached, my limbs felt heavy, and my phone screen was cracked beside me. I checked the time. 3 hours missing. The figure outside, gone. My front door, still locked from the inside. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, just existing, trying to convince myself that I was still me. But something had changed. The dreams, the missing time, the mark behind my ear, it had all been leading to something. And then I realized what was different. The hum was gone. The static in my head. The feeling of being watched. The sensation that something was crawling just beneath my skin. It had all vanished. For the first time in months, I felt alone. And that scared me more than anything, because it meant that whatever they had been doing to me was finished. I don't know why they stopped. I don't know what they wanted from me in the first place, but I do know one thing. I wasn't the same person I was before Machu Picchu. I don't dream anymore. Not in the way I used to. When I close my eyes, there's just blackness. No flashes of light, no whispers of symbols, no sense of being somewhere else. Just nothing. And some nights, when I wake up in the silence of my apartment, I feel a deep, aching absence inside me, like something is missing, like a part of me is still there, out in that vast, impossible place, standing in front of those monolithic structures under a sky that wasn't a sky. Like a part of me never really came back. I don't talk about this to anyone in real life. I know how it sounds. I know no one would believe me. But if you're reading this, if you've ever felt like time slipped for just a moment, if you've ever woken up feeling like you were somewhere else just seconds before, if you've ever caught a glimpse of something in the corner of your eye that disappeared the moment you turned your head, know this: they're still here. Maybe not watching me anymore. Maybe they got what they wanted, but they're watching someone. And one day you might find yourself looking up at the sky, feeling that strange electric hum, and realizing too late that you were never supposed to be here. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story, The Factory Worker, 2006. That night at the factory started like any other. My shift began at 10 p.m. and I was assigned to oversee one of the conveyor belts in the assembly line. It was an easy enough job, repetitive, but it paid the bills. The hum of the machines, the occasional clang of metal, and the low chatter of other workers filled the air. Everything felt normal. At least until I noticed the clock. It was 1:37 a.m. I remember that because I had just checked my watch, expecting it to be closer to 2 a.m. I sighed and turned back to my station when I saw the lights flicker. Not just a quick dimming, but a full-on, rhythmic pulsation, as if the entire factory was breathing. A strange, static-like sound filled my ears, not coming from the machinery, but from everywhere at once. My skin prickled with unease. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. They kept working, their movements sluggish, almost mechanical. My stomach churned with a strange kind of fear, like something just behind me was watching, waiting. Then everything went black. I don't remember falling, or even blinking. One second I was at my station, and the next I was somewhere else entirely. My body felt weightless, like I was floating in thick, invisible water. My vision blurred, and when I tried to move, my limbs responded sluggishly, as if I were waking from a deep sleep. Then I saw them. Tall figures, their forms eerily smooth, like metallic statues that had come to life. Their bodies weren't made of flesh, but something else, something reflective, shifting under the dim light. They weren't walking, but gliding, as if their feet never touched the ground. No faces, no mouths, just featureless heads that somehow felt aware. The worst part, they moved in perfect unison, like a single mind controlling multiple bodies. My breath came in short gasps, panic gripping my chest. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, but everything else was silent. They stood around me, observing, analyzing. Then, a searing white light engulfed me, and I felt my body jerk violently, like I was being yanked through reality itself. When I woke up, I wasn't in the factory anymore. Or at least, not the factory as I knew it. The walls were the same, but the space felt wrong. Too big, too empty. The air was thick, humming with an energy I couldn't see but could feel deep in my bones. My body ached, as if I had been stretched, pulled apart, and put back together slightly wrong. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak. I turned my head, and that's when I saw them again. The metallic figures stood at the edge of the room, still, waiting, watching. I forced myself to move, to do something, anything to break the suffocating silence. But as soon as I took a step, the space around me shifted, bending in ways that made my stomach lurch. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, adjusting, morphing, and then, suddenly, I wasn't in that room anymore. I was outside, on the roof of the factory, the freezing night air slamming into me like a wall. I collapsed, gasping for breath, my limbs trembling. Below, the factory hummed as if nothing had happened. My mind reeled, struggling to process the impossible. What had they done to me? I sat there on the roof, shivering, trying to piece together what had just happened. My hands were shaking, my breath coming out in ragged gasps, and my head felt like it had been stuffed with static. The cold metal beneath me grounded me in reality, but my mind refused to accept it. One moment I had been in that twisted, impossible version of the factory, surrounded by those things, those machines. And the next I was back, as if nothing had happened. I ran my hands over my body, checking for injuries, for anything that might explain the burning sensation under my skin, but there was nothing. No cuts, no bruises, just an overwhelming sense that I was no longer the same. I looked up at the sky, half expecting to see something unnatural hovering above, but all I saw were the stars, cold and indifferent. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me, like I had forgotten how to move. I stayed there for what felt like hours, just breathing, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode. Then, I heard the distant sound of voices below, familiar, human voices. Someone was looking for me. But for the first time in my life, the idea of seeing another person filled me with dread. Eventually they found me. My supervisor, along with 2 other workers, climbed up onto the roof, their faces twisted in confusion and concern. I could barely process what they were saying. Something about me vanishing, about security searching. Everywhere. "How the hell did you get up here?" one of them asked, but I couldn't answer. I didn't know. I couldn't even remember how I had gotten back. One second, I was in that warped, impossible place, and the next, I was here. My supervisor crouched beside me, his voice softer now, asking if I was hurt, if I needed help. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw, my tongue heavy, like something had been stuffed down my throat. Instead, I just shook my head. They helped me stand, guiding me toward the roof's access door, and I followed because I didn't know what else to do. But as we walked, I felt it again, that presence, like unseen eyes pressing down on me, watching, waiting. I turned my head sharply, expecting to see them again, standing in the shadows. But there was nothing. Only the dark expanse of the rooftop and the silent stars above. Back inside the factory, everything was exactly as it had been before. The machines whirred, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and workers moved through their tasks like nothing had happened. My workstation was untouched, as if I had never left. But I had left. I knew I had. I could still feel the weight of their hands on me, if they even had hands. My supervisor told me to take the rest of the night off, that I looked like I was about to pass out. I didn't argue. I just nodded and walked out in a daze. Outside, the air felt too sharp, too real. I half expected to wake up again, to realize I was still trapped in that impossible space, but I didn't. I walked home, my limbs still shaky, my mind a jumbled mess. I barely remember unlocking my door or collapsing onto my bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Those cold, mechanical figures standing just out of reach, waiting. And the worst part, even now I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching. I didn't go back to work the next night, or the night after that. I told them I was sick, but the truth was I couldn't step foot in that factory again. Not after what happened. I spent most of my time locked in my apartment, curtains drawn, avoiding the outside world like it would somehow keep them away. But it didn't. The feeling never left me. That eerie, suffocating sensation of being watched, of something lurking just out of my sight. At first I thought it was paranoia, my mind trying to make sense of the impossible. But then, the other. Things started happening. Flickering lights in my apartment, just like at the factory that night. The static sound, creeping in from nowhere, filling my ears until I thought I'd go insane. And the worst part, waking up in places I didn't remember falling asleep in. The first time, I found myself on my couch instead of my bed. I brushed it off, thinking I must have gotten up in the middle of the night. But the second time, I woke up standing in my bathroom, staring at my own reflection, my eyes wide and unfocused, like I wasn't even there. And the third time, I woke up outside. It was the middle of the night, and I was lying on my back in the grass, staring up at the sky. My building loomed behind me, my front door wide open. My breath caught in my throat. How the hell did I get there? My hands trembled as I sat up, my clothes damp with dew, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would break my ribs. I checked my phone, 3:13 a.m. I had gone to bed at midnight. That meant I had been somewhere else. For over 3 hours. My stomach twisted. My mind raced through the possibilities, but none of them made sense. Sleepwalking? I had never done that before in my life. A mental break? Maybe. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. Because when I stood up and turned toward my open door, I felt it again. That thick electric hum in the air, the kind that made my skin crawl. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shape. A figure. Not standing, but hovering near the edge of the trees at the far end of the property. It wasn't a person. It wasn't human. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. It was just standing there. No, not standing, but shifting, subtly, like it wasn't entirely in this world. The way the streetlight hit it, the edges of its body seemed to blur and sharpen at the same time, like it was flickering between two different realities. My stomach lurched with that same gut-wrenching feeling I had in the factory that night. I didn't need to see its face to know. It was one of them. The same metallic, fluid-like creatures that had taken me. The realization sent a jolt of raw panic through me. I turned and bolted into my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. I pressed my back against the wood, chest heaving, trying to convince myself that I was safe. But deep down, I knew better. Locking a door wouldn't keep them out. If they wanted me, they could take me, just like before. I stood there for hours, gripping a kitchen knife in my hands, listening to the silence, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did, and somehow that made it even worse. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, gripping the knife, waiting for something to break the silence. But nothing came. No noises, no strange lights, no flickering shadows shifting in the corners of my vision. It was almost worse than if something had happened, because it meant they were toying with me, watching, waiting for the right moment. When the first hints of morning light crept through my blinds, I finally let myself move. My muscles ached, my skin felt clammy, and my head was pounding. I stumbled into the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like hell, eyes sunken, skin pale, like I had been sick for weeks. But as I studied my reflection, my stomach twisted into knots. Because something was off. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. My eyes. They didn't look like mine. The color was the same, but the way they reflected light, it was almost too perfect, too sharp, like glass catching the sun at just the right angle. My breath hitched. I stepped closer, inspecting every detail, every line of my face. Was it my imagination? Just exhaustion messing with my head? I didn't know. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had changed. I needed to get out. Out of my apartment, out of town, just away. My gut told me that staying in one place, especially this place, was a mistake. I packed a small bag, shoved some clothes and essentials inside, and got in my car without even knowing where I was going. I just drove, keeping my eyes glued to the road, pushing down the paranoia clawing at the back of my mind. But no matter how far I went, the feeling didn't leave me. The presence, the static in my ears, the way the streetlights seemed to flicker just a little too long when I passed beneath them. I stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of town, trying to shake off the nerves, and went inside to grab a coffee. The cashier barely looked at me, but when she did, her eyes lingered, just for a second. And in that second, I saw it. The hesitation, the subtle confusion, like she saw something in my face that didn't belong. My stomach turned. I paid quickly and left, my hands trembling as I got back in the car. It wasn't just in my head. People could see it too. I didn't make it far before I had to stop again. My head was pounding, my vision swimming, and that strange low hum had started again, vibrating deep inside my skull. I pulled over on a desolate stretch of road, gripping the steering wheel, trying to force the world back into focus. That's when I noticed the clock on my dashboard. 3:13 a.m. That wasn't right. It had been early afternoon when I left town. I checked my phone. Same time, 3:13 a.m. My heart slammed against my ribs. I had lost almost an entire day. I had no memory of stopping, no memory of anything beyond getting back into my car at the gas station. My hands tightened around the wheel as nausea rolled through me. I turned the key, desperate to get the hell out of there, but the engine sputtered and died. And then, from the trees lining the road, I saw it. A figure. No. Figures. More than one. Their bodies shimmered under the moonlight, that same metallic, liquid-like movement that I remembered from the factory. They weren't running. They weren't even walking. They were just there, closer than they should have been, closer than was possible. My whole body went cold. My breath hitched in my throat, and my fingers dug into the steering wheel so hard they ached. I didn't blink. I couldn't. Because every time I even thought about looking away, I felt them moving, shifting forward, in that impossible, flickering way. 1 second, they were at the tree line. The next, they were closer. Not stepping, not gliding, just closer. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them, but the engine wouldn't turn over. It just clicked uselessly over and over as if the battery had died. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else, except for that faint hum, deeper now, vibrating in my bones. My stomach twisted violently, a sickening wave of nausea washing over me. I didn't want to look up again, but I had to. I forced my eyes back to the windshield, praying they were gone. But they weren't. They were right there, barely a few feet from the hood of my car, closer than any living thing should have been able to move in that short of a time. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I pressed myself against the seat, fingers gripping the door handle, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run. But the second I moved, just twitched. The world ripped apart. I can't explain what happened next. 1 second, I was inside my car, trapped in that nightmare, and the next, I was somewhere else. It wasn't the factory. It wasn't the road. It wasn't anywhere. I recognized the space around me was too dark, too vast, stretching endlessly in every direction. The air was thick, pressing down on me like a heavy, invisible force. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My body felt distant, like I wasn't even inside it anymore. And then they were there, the figures, surrounding me, hovering in that silent, empty void. No words, no movement. Just watching, studying. I felt something slithering into my mind, pressing against my thoughts, sifting through them like fingers rifling through pages of a book. I wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but I couldn't do anything. I was nothing here, just a presence, just an object being examined. My memories flickered, distorted, and in that moment I knew. I wasn't just being watched, I was being altered. And then I woke up. Just like before. No transition, no warning. Just suddenly there. I was lying in my bed, the sheets damp, with sweat, my body aching like I had been thrown down a flight of stairs. My heart was still racing, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I shot up, looking around, expecting to see them. But I was alone. My apartment was silent, still, like nothing had ever happened. I reached for my phone, desperate to check the time, the date, anything. And when I did, my blood ran cold. 3:13 a.m. Again. My stomach clenched, bile rising in my throat. Had I imagined it? Had I dreamed it? No, I knew better. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. It had happened. But there was no proof. No marks, no signs. Nothing except the crushing, undeniable feeling that I wasn't the same anymore. That something inside me had shifted. And the worst part, even now, sitting here, writing this, I can still feel them, watching, waiting, like they're not finished with me yet. Like they're just waiting for the right moment to take me back. I don't know what they did to me. I don't know what they want from me. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never be the same again. I try to go about my life, to pretend everything is normal. But it isn't. The lights still flicker. The static still hums in my ears. And Sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, there's a metallic taste in my mouth, like something foreign is seeping into me, rewriting me from the inside out. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that night in the factory. Maybe I'm not me anymore. Maybe I never made it back at all. Maybe I'm just a copy, a version of myself they let return. And the real me, I don't even want to think about where he might be. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you have had a similar experience or have suggestions for future horror stories, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.